September 9th, 2006, Saturday morning in the Loop. A crew climbs a cherry picker to the corner of State and Washington and starts unbolting a sign that had been welded to that corner for over 100 years. Gold letters, dark green background, Marshall Field and Company. Inside, the 7.5-ton bronze clock kept ticking. They had installed it in 1897. Up above, the Tiffany Dome, the only Tiffany glass mosaic dome in the world, 1.6 million pieces of iridescent glass, was already shining for another store. By Tuesday, they had painted the new sign. Macy's red letters, same bronze that had been there since your great-grandparents were kids. And Chicago still has not forgiven them. This is the story of how one executive in a Cincinnati boardroom erased the most beloved store in the Midwest because of something he called consumer data. But to understand why people still get a knot in their throat walking past that corner, you have to understand what Marshall Fields actually was. Marshall Fields showed up in Chicago in 1856. He was 22 years old, came from Conway, Massachusetts, and started as a clerk in a dry goods store. 25 years later, in January of 1881, he owned the whole thing and had put his name on the door. But the line that made the store legendary was not his. It came from an employee one ordinary afternoon when a customer walked in asking for something absurd and a manager tried to refuse her. Field walked over, looked at the manager, and said 5 words that became American retail doctrine. Give the lady what she wants. Everything else came from that. The no questions asked return policy was Field's invention. The customer is always right. They offered free childcare so moms could shop in peace. A staff doctor was on the payroll in case someone fainted during a fitting. 11 restaurants inside one store. 11. The building you know today was finished in 1907, 12 stories, a full city block between State, Washington, Wabash, and Randolph. When you walked in, you looked up and saw a dome that Louis Comfort Tiffany had designed personally. It took 18 months to install. It's still there, untouched. Marshall Field, the man, died of pneumonia in January of 1906. He left his grandson $120 million in 1906 money. Today, that is over $4 billion. He was the richest man in the Midwest, probably the richest in the country after Rockefeller. But the store didn't die with him. The opposite. The next 70 years were the golden age. The Walnut Room, 7th floor. Walnut panels shipped in from Circassia. They served chicken pot pie from Mrs. Herring's recipe, the same recipe since the Depression. People stood in line on Saturdays 2-3 hours to eat lunch under the Christmas tree. Every November, in the middle of the room, they raised a 40-foot pine, decorated with thousands of lights and hand-blown glass ornaments. If you grew up anywhere in Chicagoland between 1950 and the year 2000, you went at least once. Your mom put your good coat on you. She licked her thumb and fixed your hair in the elevator. Someone took a blurry picture of you with a Kodak Instamatic. You stuck it in a shoebox. And now, 30 years later, that picture is worth more than the building itself because the store where it was taken doesn't exist anymore. And the Frangos. I have to talk about them. Little square mint chocolates wrapped in green foil, made in copper kettles on the 13th floor of the building since 1929. They cranked out over 1,200,000 of them a day. When the south wind blew in October, you could smell chocolate and mint 2 blocks away. It was part of the air in the Loop, literally. And this is where the story goes sideways. In March of 1982, Betas Incorporated, the American subsidiary of British American Tobacco, the London Cigarette Company, bought Marshall Fields for $310 million cash. It was a defensive move. The corporate raider Carl Icahn had accumulated almost 30% of the stock and was about to take the company hostile. Fields chose to sell to the British Tobacco Company rather than fall to Icahn. Ask yourself how this makes sense. A London cigarette company running the most Chicago store in the city. It did not make sense to anyone, and it showed. The next 8 years were exactly what you would expect. Departments cut, services killed. Then in 1990, Bates flipped Fields to Dayton Hudson Corporation, the Minneapolis chain that owned Target, a Minnesota company buying the high-end store of Chicago. Most Chicagoans still thought the building was immortal, but the ending had already started, and nobody was looking. They saw it in 1999. That March, Dayton Hudson announced they were closing the 13th floor candy kitchen. They laid off 157 workers. Some of them had been hand-making frangos for 30 years. Production was moving to a Gertrude Hawk Chocolates factory in Gardners, Pennsylvania. 600 miles from State Street. Chicago lost its mind. Mayor Richard M. Daley, the second one and son of the legendary mayor, met personally with the president of Marshall Fields to beg him to reconsider. Service Employees International Union Local 1 gathered thousands of signatures looking for another Chicago factory. There were hearings at City Hall. Mary Schmick, the Tribune columnist, wrote that the Frango had lost the folkloric taste of Chicago. That line stuck. That was the dress rehearsal. The real betrayal was still coming. In July of 2004, Target Corporation announced they were selling Marshall Fields to May Department Stores Company. May owned chains like Lord & Taylor, Filene's, Hecht's, a collection of regional department stores in slow-motion trouble. 7 months later, in February of 2005, Federated Department Stores bought all of May for $11 billion in cash and stock, plus $6 billion in assumed debt. $17 billion total, the biggest retail transaction in American history up to that point. Federated owned Macy's, and this is where the man who made the call walks on stage. Terry Lundgren. He was CEO, president, and later chairman of Federated, a career retail executive raised on Long Island. Lundgren looked at his new empire, over 800 stores operating under 12 different regional names. Marshall Fields, Filene's, Hecht's, Foley's, Kaufmann's, Robinson's May, Strawbridge's, Famous Bar. He decided to rationalize the brand. One store, one name, Macy's in red, coast to coast. The announcement came in September of 2005. The transition would execute exactly 1 year later. Lundgren gave an interview to the Chicago Tribune where he said he understood the emotional concerns, but that consumer data showed a unified national brand was stronger. That was his word, data. What the data didn't tell him is that Chicago was never about data. A group formed. Fields fans. Chicago. 2 women led it. Neither of them worked in fashion. They collected over 100,000 signatures. They organized protests in front of the store. Signs read, "Marshall Fields is Chicago, Macy's is not." On the day of the switch, September 9, 2006, they did something that became legend in the city. They walked into the newly rebranded Macy's. They grabbed expensive clothes off the racks. They went into the fitting rooms. They left the clothes hanging there for hours without buying anything to jam the operation. No yelling, no spectacle. Just expensive merchandise abandoned in fitting rooms all day. Sales at the State Street store dropped 22% that first year. Macy's reported significant operating losses across the entire Midwest region for the next 3 years. Hundreds of millions of dollars all over a sign. Terry Lundgren defended the decision to the end. In 2008, in the middle of the financial crisis, Analysts asked him if he would reconsider giving the name back to State Street. He said no. He said the short term is painful, but the long term is right. So what did the long term give us? By 2015, almost a decade later, Macy's admitted the Midwest region was still underperforming. The State Street store lost 3 full floor ors. They closed them, leased them out, and turned them into offices. On the ground floor, the space became a Walgreens where they used to sell Chanel. The Marshall Fields clock is still on the corner. It's on the facade because it is protected by Chicago landmark designation granted on November 1st, 2005, which was 10 months before the name change, almost like the city saw it coming. Macy's literally could not have removed it if they had wanted to. There is a bronze plaque underneath that reads Marshall Field and Company. The Tiffany Dome is still there too. The Christmas tree still goes up every November in the Walnut Room, but the sign at the front door says Macy's. The Frangos are still around. Macy's sold the brand in 2017 to Garrett Brands, and it finally came back to Chicago hands. 10 years late, they make the 1-pound boxes at Cupid Candies on the South Side now for local distribution. The smell on the corner is not quite the same, but it is something. Marshall Field gave the lady what she wanted for 128 years. Terry Lundgren gave her what the data said, and the data never measured the only thing that mattered: